Good afternoon, everyone. We are gathered here to, we have started a webinar series where we are looking at the challenges in recruitment, the recruitment trends, and so on and so forth. Uh, in our series of webinars, we're going to be talking to leaders in various sectors. And in this particular webinar, we have got someone from the in a banking side of things. What we're trying to do is basically try to understand what is happening in the sector, what are the challenges in the sector, what are the trends, and how are they recruiting so that you can actually be equipped to really be ready for anything that a potential recruitment agent or a HR person or even the person who's interviewing you, your manager or potential manager, could ask of you. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Adil Delaboy, who's speaking here in his personal capacity. He's got experience in the banking sector and various things. I'll let him introduce himself rather than me talking about him. Adil, over to you.
Thank you, Ram. So, firstly, welcome everyone. My name's Adil Dalaboy. I am a director, and I'm speaking in my personal capacity, as Ram mentioned. At this moment in time, I work for Credit Suisse, a Swiss investment bank, but I have experience of working with banks both in the Canadian markets and in the Australian markets, and in my role as a technology director, have worked with teams globally across the institutions that I've been a part of. And thank you, Ram, for inviting me to come and talk about what I see as challenges in recruitment and hiring in this sector.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adil. And just a brief introduction about myself. I'm the co-founder of Compaira, and I'm a serial entrepreneur. And I've actually got a PhD in human capital management. I used to work in various industries from healthcare, hospitality to telecoms. And I've been dabbling in various consulting and software as service offerings the past 20 years. Gosh, that sounds like I'm an old man, but here you go. So, what I would like to do is I'd like to actually start the conversation by really looking at some of the key challenges that are existing in the industry. So, I'm going to ask, I've just got, you know, a few slides where we will start talking about the specific topics that are there. So, Adil, if I look at the current state of the banking industry or the banking sector, well, what is happening at this moment from a talent perspective, and what are the things that people are doing to address those issues from a talent perspective?
Sure, thank you, Ram. So I think first of all, from a talent perspective, I think a few points that I would say is that all the banks are very different, right? A common thing that I think people applying in particular to the investment banking or banking sector fail to appreciate is that all banks have a very unique culture. The culture, for example, at a Canadian institution that I worked at versus a Swiss versus an Australian was very different. And what, as a consequence, meant that you needed to be able to be successful in those organizations was different, right? The attributes of the individual that these banks would look for is different. Secondly, in terms of sort of the skill sets and what we need as a trend, more and more what we're seeing, generally speaking, in the banking world, or the banking industry, is electronification or a use of technology both to cut costs and to streamline processes. So, and I'll give you a couple of examples. If you think of the time that most of us were growing up, including myself, a few years down the road, most of your high street banking, you did most of your individual banking by going to your branch. So whether you wanted, a mortgage or you wanted to open an account, all of that, you went and you spoke to your high street manager, and if you were, in most cases, the bank manager was someone, certainly in our father's time, was someone you would have a relationship with. Today, most of us can do a lot of those activities, certainly in the Western world, on our phone. Right? If you take the investment banking world as similarly, the technology is a big differentiator and enabler. We When I joined the industry many years ago, a lot of, for example, the fixed income bond trading business was done on a relationship basis. Salespeople would pick up the phone, would call up their clients, they would talk about what was happening in that person's industry, that person's company, and then you would, over a period of time, build an understanding of your counterparts plus that company and make recommendations. Today, a lot of exchanges have been set up, right? And you advertise your positions and your prices in the bonds market on these various exchanges. So technology has been a big enabler. As a consequence of these trends, from a recruitment perspective, I guess two bits that I would advise anyone who's trying to come in is, first of all, understand the culture of the organization that you're trying to do and how culturally you may fit in with the team. Secondly, we're certainly seeing that at all levels of the firm, some sort of technical understanding is required. And the last piece that I would say, in addition to technology, anything, is regulation. This industry post 2008 has become more and more regulated. So having an appreciation of the various regulations that impact this industry that you're trying to join it as an individual is key. So as a success from a recruitment point of view, I think generally speaking, for anyone trying to come into the banking industry, understand what your bank is like. They're not the same. The culture across teams and within banks differs. Secondly, understand what is important to them from a regulatory point of view, the jurisdictions that they operate in, what are they subject to, and then thirdly, what are they perhaps trying to use from a technology point of view to differentiate themselves. Key things that someone coming into the industry should have knowledge of, regardless of role.
So, I mean, interesting that you mentioned culture and you're saying that people who want to get into the banking industry should know the culture. I know you are British, but you have actually worked in an Australian, Canadian, and Swiss outfit for banking. How did you actually find out about the culture? Is there anything that people can do to go and see what the culture is like? What would you
Yeah,
suggest? How would you get information about the culture?
it's a great question, and I've made mistakes, and I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of a hopefully a story that'll show you how you can get this wrong and from my own experience. I spent most of my I was born and brought up in the UK, and when I joined an organization, I joined a Swiss organization. The culture was very similar to the way I worked, very conservative. Um, but for example, from an admin perspective, very thorough, a lot of bureaucracy. I then switched to a Canadian organization, and a mistake from me where I didn't understand the culture was Canada has a lot of various different nationalities. As you know, last a lot of migration over the last few years into that country, and they are as a consequence, everyone in generally in Canada is very conscious of making sure that you do not upset someone from a different culture and background. And when you have a conversation with them, you need to make sure that you understand that, and you also understand that from purely from a Canadian point of view, you get agreement. So I, for example, was very used to, given my background, uh, when I had a conversation with someone, and we discussed a point of view or a plan or a piece of work. If at the end of that conversation that individual did not say anything, I took that to mean their consent, that they had agreed with what I had said and I would walk away. That was not the case in Canada, right? If someone didn't agree to what you said, or you left or didn't say anything, that didn't mean that they consented. In fact, meant that the conversation was yet to be closed. Right? Culturally, as I said, something that I learned the hard way, but you need to be aware of. How would you learn about the culture, which was your question of your organization? So I would say two things that I would recommend. One, to be fair, technology again, Google. If you Google, the culture of any bank that you can think of today, you will actually find there quite a few articles that explain and will give you an idea of key attributes of what is looked for or is seen as success over there. So that's something I in fact learned in due course. Secondly, I would say try and talk to people, right? You will, if you can within your network find someone who has worked at that institution, and if not, ask your contacts to see if they have someone who's working in an institution. Find a way to talk to people because you will get some good insights on what they would look for.
Brilliant. I mean, that's very interesting and useful insight. Uh, I was also thinking probably the annual report kind of gives sets the tone, at least from a people perspective, some of the things that they say. Probably that's another area which you could look into. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay. So, I mean, it's an interesting topic. We could come back to this, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to look at various chunks and then get into some meaty discussion at a later stage. So, the next thing I would love to actually look at is what is happening in banking sector from a technology perspective. Earlier, you mentioned that technology is becoming a key aspect in anything that you do. I mean, we hear terms like AI and blockchain and all that, but I don't know what, I mean, a lot of people who are starting out or even who are young technologists can't visualize how blockchain or that kind of a scenario is applicable to a banking environment. So, can you explain what is the role of technology in recruitment in the banking sector? So, walk
Okay.
me through the
So
journey of a
specifically about
candidate.
recruitment. Oh, look, I think certainly um, the use of technology in recruitment uh, has changed. I don't think things have certainly evolved as far as perhaps apologies, um, as far as some other industries from using technology to enable recruitment. A lot of the industry still relies on you applying the or I would say the old-fashioned way, where you see a role, you apply, you submit your CV, and then you are called to fill in an application form. What I've seen has changed in the last 10 years is that certainly competency based testing has become part of that process. So banks are using technology to say, rather than you just providing your CV and your filling out the application form for them, they will ask you to do a test based on logic and certainly about language and logic. Like can you do basic English, basic math, or whatever the language is. Certainly puzzles and logic thinking, I think, is something that I'm seeing widely being used across the industry. Um, and then also from a technology point of view and recruitment, AI and data are being used to word match, if you like, people's profile. And something that we see today. I mean, profiles like LinkedIn, for example, if you register your profile, they will tell you that you are or are not a suitable candidate for a job because they look for words in the profile that you set or recommendations that you get. So that is clearly there. I would also say that besides the bank's own systems, tools like LinkedIn, right, are certainly gaining um, a lot of a lot of sort of prominence in the industry, right? The besides your own in-house systems, people will certainly use something like LinkedIn as a great example. If you're looking for a particular role, you will go and see who you have got within your own network or who you can find in LinkedIn. Because I think there's a few things, to be fair, that platform has got right in terms of sort of identifying the matches, the recommendations. They allow you to get a further insight of what that individual is like before you call them in for an interview.
Okay. So, you spoke about banks using competence tests and so on and so forth. So, what are the skills and qualifications currently in demand in the banking sector? And when you say competence, what do you mean by that? Because it's a broad area, isn't it? Competence could be anything and everything under the sun. So, are there some specific key competencies that people need to have to get into the banking sector?
It's a good question. Okay, so let me perhaps start with the competence and then I'll come to the skills. So I think that from a competency perspective, the very first thing is I would say that you will generally need to have a desire to be involved in the financial services industry, and also be someone who is quite um, willing to work with a lot of uncertainty and pressure, right? Um, and the ability to communicate and team skills would be core competencies, because you work in a high pressured environment in the banking industry, regardless of what, typically what role you are doing. There's always targets to meet, right? You know, if you think of what's happening in the last few days in the industry, where um, with the collapses of the banks in the US, and then the Swiss banks, and I think today Deutsche Bank is going through some different challenges. We can see that consumer confidence in banking is shaky, right? So there will be pressure. Interest rates are going up. There's a lot of defaults, mortgages, everything that we all think of. Depending on which sector you are in operating in a bank, there will be pressure on you to hit targets and make your entity profitable, right, or contribute towards that. So teamwork as a competency, I think, is standard. The ability to cope and provide solutions under pressure, I would say, is a second, and the ability to network.
Okay,
Those would be the
interesting.
three that I would um, uh, call out. Skills. I think it depends on the area of the bank that you're trying to go into, right? So if you are going into, say, the investment banking space, then mathematics, certainly financial planning skills, a background in banking helps. Technology, what we're seeing in terms of today, the current trends are data and analytics, a lot of emphasis on that. So, people looking for Python developers, data scientists, etc. And the reason for that, for example, is that they are looking, banks collect a large amount of data, amass a large amount of data, and they want to be able to now use that to make sure that they better understand their customers, but also to be able to drive transactions further. Right? So, data analytics things. There are also a bunch of core skills from a technology perspective. Again, C Sharp, .NET, Java, programming have been around in most systems that I've seen in the banking world for a while now, and are still very much in demand.
Okay. See, I mean, what you spoke about skills, it's easier to demonstrate on your CV, right? But what you spoke about competencies, like the ability to work under pressure, how will you demonstrate that in a CV? Because I'm
You
reading
can't.
something. So how do
You
you,
can't.
you can't, if you can't, so are you saying that we need to, the
Not,
candidate needs to have examples of their ability to work under pressure and things like that ready to be shared during the interview process?
the answer is yes, absolutely, right? Because that is what will be done. So if I use myself as an example, both where I have interviewed or where I am the interviewing or the interviewer, I've certainly seen the interview is a place where folks will, for example, throw out logic puzzles at you. So you'll be asked to think about hypothetical scenarios and provide an answer to that. So things like um, you've been hired. I'll give you an example of a question that I've used. You've been hired as a by Boeing to divine a to put together a plan for a new version of Air Force One. How would you go about doing that? I'm not going to go through the question. But if you just think about what that question I've asked you, there's multiple angles to it, right? You've not been asked to build the plane. You've not been asked to build Air Force One. I've asked you to come up with a plan to build a new version of Air Force One. So your attention to detail is captured. The number of candidates I've seen fail because they did not capture that I wanted a plan, not them to build a new version of Air Force One. Right? Is there then folks who've actually captured it? They need to appreciate that there are a number of stakeholders on something like Air Force One. Right? There would be the current and past presidents of the United States. Clearly, the special services are going to have a large number of requirements in terms of the plane. The aviation authorities will have a large number of requirements on the number of what that plane should look like, right? The taxpayers may have a view, or someone representing the taxpayers, how much are they willing to spend on a new version of Air Force One, right? Boeing's own capabilities come into to question. So there's many ways that you can take that, and if you can demonstrate that you are thinking through those angles, that is a great way of showing how someone would, under pressure, is responding to that question, right? And you see it. You will very quickly think. You will see folks who are able to logically think through this and start thinking of solutions and angles that they should think through, or those versus those who go down a path because they haven't paid attention or completely crumble, right? We also would use, um, besides the interview scenario, the other thing that is commonly being done, and I see, is that folks ask you to come into the offices. Now, to be fair, it was easier pre-COVID, but I think it's coming back now, to come and interface with the team, right? And sit and just have a conversation with them about your interests in that area. And again, that requires you to be well prepared for that half an hour. It may be seen as an informal chat, but what we're trying to assess is how much do you really understand the industry and the role that you're applying for, and how much do you have an interest in that area.
Interesting. So
Hopefully
when
that
you
answers
actually,
the question.
yeah, and it did, and that actually opens up quite a few things that I would like to explore. Like for example, if you look at it, the question that you said, if you're asked to design an Air Force One, uh, you know, that varies for different levels of experience, right? So if you're going to ask a Gen Z or a millennial, if I'm allowed to say that, uh, their level of expectations or experience and exposure determine the quality of answers they provide, right? So, do you actually have a set of questions that you normally use, or is it basically something that you've already experienced? You have experienced personally, which you then, use to screen candidates. Is there, I mean, the long and short of it is, are there any books or resources that these candidates can
People
go
can
to?
use. Yeah,
Yeah,
good question. So to be fair, to answer your question, I do have my own set of questions, which I would use for various levels of recruitment. And you're absolutely right. The level of the questions that I would ask are someone straight out of university versus someone with 15 to 20 years experience. The roles will vary, but the process is the same, right? I still want to judge how they react under pressure, how they cope, how they think. And then to answer your second question in terms of, are there um, resources available, the answer is yes, right? So, for, well, what I'll say, one of my frustrations is there isn't a place where you can go to and get all these resources together. But for example, if you think of the test piece that I spoke about, if you Google job tests from most of the institutions, the banking world that you're applying for, you will find websites that we'll share examples of their tests or help you prepare for them. Most of these sites will charge you some money to come and have a look at it, but that is available. And then in terms of sort of the pressure scenarios that folks could have a look at, right, and prepare for. Again, if you Google for things like techniques or pressure tests done by these you will find them, right. What I would say for the younger folks, that people coming straight out of university or entrance into this industry, it's very useful talking to your career service, because the the universities that the banks are targeting, they will spend some time with their career service detailing these resources and how folks can best prepare.
okay, interesting. I mean, this is going back to my uni days, which is, I mean, it's a long time back. We used to have something called wet feet, which basically would ask questions like these, where you can actually go through it, and then probably there are resources that are available, like you say, and Google is the best place to kickstart the journey, which is brilliant. Now, what I would love to do is basically, we've just covered the broad scheme of things. I'd like to go a bit deeper into certain aspects of what we spoke about earlier. So one of the things that I see is basically, and I always hear this, is don't recruit for skill, recruit for attitude. So what we have been talking about, we've talked about skills and competencies, ability to perform. All those are the things that everyone uses. But when it comes to recruiting people and how they then perform individually and as a team, it all boils down to attitude, right? So what would you would how would you look for the right kind of attitude? How do you evidence that? If I'm a candidate, how can I evidence it in my CV that I've got the right attitudes? Or is there something else that I could show to the potential employer that I have the right skill set
Skills.
and have the right? How do I do that?
I think it's a gap, quite frankly, in the industry today, right? That you can demonstrate your skills. So again, if let's use the technology side because it's about technology and banking, you can demonstrate that you have, the Excel skills, you have the SQL skills, you have Perl, Python, SQL, whatever. You can put that on your CV. You can come and do a test. But you're absolutely right, and I think it ties back to what I said earlier. Each organization's culture is different. Therefore, the behavior and competencies that you need to succeed in that organization differs. And the way banks today try and identify for that, or do matches for that, is through the profiling tests, right? Um, I personally think it would be great, for example, to have a solution that allowed someone to bring all these things together. So not only did you get a CV, but you got an indication up front on the CV of what sort of profile they have. And if you could profile your team or yourself, you could then say if there's a match, right? And maybe if I expand on this a little bit further, I know that it's something that Ram, you and I have discussed. It is an area of frustration for me because a lot of the jobs in this industry are highly paying, and but what folks may fail to appreciate is that they're high paying because they're highly pressurized and they're small teams of people working on a problem. Right? To be profitable organizations, banks, while you may here have thousands of people, but if you look at the individual team, they tend to be small teams who are put under a lot of pressure to deliver something. You'll never find anyone who works in the banking industry turn around and say that I've not got a lot of pressure on my plate to get done, or not working long hours, or so that competency and behavior and values thing is really important, because as a manager, if you will be looking for one of two things: either you're really happy with the culture and the values and the competency of your team members, besides it, when you hire someone, you want to be able to make sure in that instance that they have those same values and all that um, you value, and then therefore they're adding to that team and strengthening it. Or you might be looking for someone alternatively to disrupt something, right? Um, it's the culture of the team is not efficient, and therefore you want someone to come in and shake things around, right, or change things. Again, you want to be able to make sure that you're identifying the individual who has done that. And as I said, where you are lucky, psychometric tests come in and will provide you with some insights. But very often, I've seen in the various institutions I've worked in today, it's not part of the process.
Okay. I mean, funny you say that because that's what we try to do in Compara, but more about us later. Uh, we talked about the role of talent, what's happening at a very strategic level. Now I want to get to some brass tacks, so some clear tactics. So to do that, I'm going to ask you a few questions. So allow me to indulge myself in this. So one of the things I would love to actually understand from your view or from your team's view is what are the key challenges you face when it comes to recruiting talent for your team or your team's team?
Excellent question. So the biggest challenge um, is the length of the process, right? And I think that's partly attributed to, sorry, it's fully attributed to what Lovely discussed, right? Because to identify the right candidate, not only do I need to make sure that they've got the technical skills, and I'm talking about purely from that I need, so they're competent in those skills that I need. I need to be able to make sure that from a behavior and values point of view, I feel they will be a good fit for that team. And I also need to be able to make sure that I see them as being someone who's a problem solver, logical, smart, so that they can deal with the pressures. That's just for me. That's one individual, if you think about it. If I'm hiring for someone in my team, typically they not only need to satisfy me, but they would need to satisfy members of my team to be successful. So the interview process uh, takes weeks, and typically it's it'll be a few rounds of interviews with various people before someone is successful.
Interesting.
So that's one of the frustrations, right? So and then I think a lot of it. Secondly, there isn't, as I said, because there isn't a solution today that combines all these elements that we spoke about, right? Whether it's the testing of the skills, testing of how intelligent the person is, building their profile together. It takes a while to bring all that information together. Um, so, in fact, a lot of, to be fair, even today, the hiring in the banking world, unfortunately, I think occurs through recommendations rather than uh, the application process that you would hope with all the technology and all has been adopted. Certainly at senior levels.
Interesting. Okay. So, I mean, that's that's again, uh, it's throwing a lot of insight. So, a typical candidate, let's say at a middle management level, how many rounds of interview? I mean, I'm not going to hold you to it, but take, how many rounds of interview would they
I
actually
can
have
I
to go
can answer
through?
that. So at minimum, you're dealing with about 5 to 6, right? And I would say typically it could go up to about 10.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. So the candidate has to be consistent and have. So does it mean that they need to prepare slightly differently for every interview, or do you expect them to be themselves because then you are actually getting to see the person? Because there is a lot of, I remember when you speak to the career management services in the unis, they say, oh, you need to tweak your CV for the role and so on and so forth. But the company is recruiting the whole person, right? So
Yeah.
when I'm going through multiple interviews, do I need to prepare additionally, or I just be myself because they're recruiting me as a package because I can't act.
Excellent
If I
question.
act, I get
Yep.
fired.
No, excellent question. Yep. Excellent question. No, I think I'm going to touch on 2 points today. Should you tweak your CV um, to get a job that you want? I think the answer to that question is yes, because you know CV screening today occurs in 2 phases in this industry, right? Number one is the matching based service, if you like, that, as I said, whether LinkedIn uses or our own in-house technologies use. If you do not have the words that match up with what that job description is looking for, you very often will be filtered out for that reason. So it is worthwhile investing the time to to make sure you're demonstrating the words and the things that the job spec is looking for. So tweak it each time if there's a need to be. Secondly, in terms of screening, because the second stage of screening is manual, right? And that again is the manager looking for behaviors, competencies, but also those skills. So again, tweaking your CV to demonstrate that is right. So these are your first 2 layers of filtration before you get to an interview. But you're absolutely right. In terms of the interview process, you want to be yourself, right? And, otherwise, I mean, if the way I look at it is, you're not going to be able to pretend on the job every single day, right? So either you're the right fit for the organization or you're not.
Okay. Now, that's very interesting. Now, I would like to understand the process of how I could actually get a bank to consider me as a candidate. So, what is the normal route, you know, candidates could take to, find a job within the bank? I mean, when I say routes, do they actually apply, on the website based on the vacancies, or do they actually go through a recruitment agent? Because I know some institutions in the retail space have specific recruitment agencies who help them find the talent. And so, what are the channels that a candidate can look at to actually get into the
Excellent.
banking sector?
Do you mind if I break this down into 3 answers? Because I think it depends on which stage of your career you're looking for a job and where you're looking to get in, right? So I think there's the university graduates and those with 1 to 2 years experience. Then those with that plus to the middle management, and then there's the senior. So I'm going to answer it in those three phases. If you are someone who's trying to enter at the entry level, right, or you're a recent graduate, or you're someone who's graduating, then to be fair, the ways of coming in are limited. You do have to go through the websites that the company set up. You do have to go through all those tests that HR and all will set up. If you are someone who's got a couple of years' experience, then a recruitment agent will have those junior jobs and put you forward for them. For people who've been at a bank for 2 to 3 years and then are now looking for the next opportunity. So yes, some tips that I would say for folks at that level is that if you are someone who's looking to get into the industry at the absolute junior level, coming out of university, internships and work experience is a way to differentiate yourself, right? Because um, I'm going to tell you a story about that. I years ago was recruiting in Manchester for one of my institutions, a Swiss-based institution, and clearly a graduate did not know, the Credit Suisse institution I worked for at the time was a Swiss investment bank. So they came and they read over there and they said, "Oh, Credit Suisse, oh great, do you make chocolate?" Now, you can understand how that conversation went, right? Their ability to make any impression on me after that was dead because if I have to tell you that you are an investment bank, you're gone. So, knowing the brand, knowing, having done some internships and some work experience is a great way of differentiating yourself when you're trying to enter, right? Because also it'll give you some references and allow you to demonstrate that your industry, you are interested in that industry. Um, if we go and then also a lot of the tests and things like that, as I said, preparing for the graduate level tests and all that your career service would help you. The middle management layer, so after you've been in the industry for, out of university and out for 2 to 3 years, and you're now trying to come in at that 3 year plus mark, a lot of the recruitment does, to be fair, occur through one of two means. One is through recruitment agents, right? And job boards like LinkedIn, etc., right? That tends to be in cases where the institution does not have someone who can readily be moved into that role or someone isn't interested in it, but there's plenty of them. And there certainly will be adverts, uh, positions advertised by recruitment agents and job boards. But a good way of bypassing, or if you like, increasing your success in those is networking and knowing what values and competencies you have and what that company has. Right. So again, it ties back to what you were saying, Ram. If you have a better understanding of that organization, the values and behaviors that they look for, and they tie back with what you see for yourself, then networking is a great way to to get an introduction and target those jobs. The senior level, very much to be fair, is even today based on your experience and networking, right? And quite frankly, you will find that when you look for the director or MD level positions, there aren't that many advertised in the public domain. Yeah, because individuals who have got to that level tend to know what does and what doesn't work for them, and they tend to select individuals that way based on folks who are in their portfolio of contacts.
Okay. Now, just to lighten up, I just want to see what are the common mistakes that you see in a candidate's application. One you mentioned, when they sent for the bank, they thought they make chocolates. I mean, that's lack of knowledge about the brand. That's one thing. But what are the common mistakes that you see beyond that in a candidate's application, which tends to put people off straight away?
In the application or in the interviewing process or both?
Yeah, application and the interviewing process. We'll cover
So
both.
this way both. Yeah, absolutely. In the applications, I would say common things are long CVs, for example, right? You need to be able to sell yourself in 2 pages, right? Not tying the CV back to the skills that we're looking for. And when I think when you read a job spec and they're asking you for a particular competency, you need to think about what examples you have and what you would talk about over then in your bullet points, right? Like expand it, be numeric, be able to. You're working for a bank, you want to be able to quantify the impact that you have had on a particular role in your role, right? To demonstrate those skills. Um, I think the other way that I'm going to try to change the question a little bit. I'm going to say, how can you differentiate yourself in that process, right? In the application process, uh, it's not. I mean, what I would say is, don't be afraid to put yourself out there and be a little bit bold, right? A well formatted CV. But with a little bit of color or a little bit of differences in the presentation, and I've seen a few of those recently, actually stands out, right? So you want to think about, how am I going to stick out from the crowd when this document goes in front. So you made sure it's got the right words, you've got the right examples. That's the first part, as we were saying. When it comes out in front of the individual, if he sees everything black and white and he can't see, you know, if you see a CV that's so actually the guys put columns or has put a border, you'll be surprised. It actually does stick out, right? Don't be afraid also to put yourself out there. One of the CVs of an individual that I hired did something very clever. So his CV had come to me through a recruitment agent, but when he came to interview me, he came with a file, and it had his CV on one side, and it had an aspirin pin stuck with sellotape on it. Young graduate, very cocky. But he came and he said to me, he said, right, well, when we started, he was like, here you go. Do you have a copy of my CV? I was like, no, I was just going to get it. It's like, here you go. Here's a copy of my CV. And I opened it, it had a disprint, and it made me laugh. He was like, if you need it after this interview. Obviously he was being cocky, but I did hire him, right? Because he was different. It showed that, he was trying to highlight a part of his personality, which was difficult to come across. So think about how you differentiate yourself on the interview process. The biggest mistakes that I see tie back to not understanding the brand and culture of the worst case. It's not understanding the industry, but most people hopefully don't make that mistake. It's understanding the brand, understanding the culture, and having spoken to folks, or having read about what that means, because you'll be able to demonstrate your technical skills and all if you've got them at that point. Before you get to the interviews, that's been screened. I'll give you something practical. Uh, if you were if you were interviewing a um, for most of the European banks, most of us would today expect to wear a suit and shirt and tie, right? Yep. If you're turning up in Israel, or even if you're doing a team or a Zoom's call, you would show yourself as being formal. That's not necessarily the culture in North America, particularly for the technology jobs, right? Because there's an appreciation over the years that technologists spend a lot of time, even in a financial institution like a bank, sitting on their seat, um, typing and producing code or dealing with problems, and therefore they need to be comfortable. So wearing a t-shirt and jeans, for example, to an interview with a jacket, as long as you're smart casual, is acceptable.
Interesting. Interesting. I mean, one of the things I have seen, which is totally different, is someone articulating their experience in like a spider graph, a radar chart, which is totally different. And I've seen someone use, your timeline to demonstrate their experience, their education, everything. So the CV had only three pictures. One was basically the timeline from an education and where the careers, went up or down or whatever. And then below they had a box which explained it, why they took a break and what happened. The second one is the radar graph on the various roles that they have worked with summary of the key skills and competencies that they've acquired. And the third thing is unique things that belong, make them unique. That's it. It's just three
Yep.
chunks, and it just stood out for me. I mean, that's it's about getting creative, isn't it? Because as we said earlier on, the market has got a lot of talent, and everyone is vying for a limited number of opportunities. And given that employers have actually got a lot of choice these days, the onus comes back to the candidate to actually differentiate themselves and set themselves apart. Now, I mean, we're drawing close to the end of the conversation. So I'd like to ask you one question, which basically is, what if you were to summarize your advice to candidates, whoever is listening to this, what are the three things that you would say you need to actually look out for? Or, if you do these three things, that'll be brilliant for you to actually get an opportunity to, go to the next stage of an interview.
Sure. I think first of all, know your organization and its culture. Right. We spoke about that extensively. Do the research. Right. Do the research on the organization and its culture. Secondly, be prepared. Right. And as I said, whether it's logic tests, numeracy tests, language tests, you will find these, I think, more and more commonly across the selection process today. So if that isn't one of your strengths or you're weak in maths or logic, or there's loads of solutions out there today that you can use to practice. Thirdly, what I would say is do some interview practice, right? Because today the way the industry works is that they do use that to understand your value and cultures, because we don't really have anything else that allows us to take shortcuts in there. So do practice, right? Do some practice questions and things like that. If you can find someone from the industry who's willing to give you some time. So, for example, at least Credit Suisse, the organization that I work for, and CIBC, I know, offer in the UK, and I think, to be fair, in most parts of the world, mock interview practices. And that is something that I would advise for anyone who's looking to come and join the industry to avail of.
Okay. So when you say mock interview practices, candidates can just apply for that, or how
Yeah,
do how do
you
you?
have to apply exactly. You have to apply, to have someone in the bank do a mock interview with you.
Interesting, and you get a feedback as to what you're good at, what you're not, and then you can then work on those areas that you need to be improving.
Correct. Yes.
Brilliant, brilliant. So thanks, Adil, for your time. I mean, I just want to, just say what we do as, I'm not, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of what we do, but I just wanted to, throw this out there. We actually are a platform which uses AI and behavioral algorithms to help candidates perfect their profile and help them get closer to their dream job. They have got a psychometrics and values and competence based engines that the candidates fill up, which is then compared automatically to the company's requirement. It evidences a lot of things that the company asks for with the candidate requirements. And then the candidates just get shortlisted. And the process of getting shortlisted also is shortened. Companies provide a feedback as to why the candidate got shortlisted or did not get shortlisted, which means that becomes part of the candidate's training and development objectives going forward. Now, what I would love to do is basically thank. It's We are almost at the end of the time, so I'd love to thank you, Adil, for your time and for sharing your valuable insights. And I hope everyone found the session useful and insightful. And we're looking forward to seeing you in the next webinar series, which will be almost in a month's time. Thank you. Thanks for your time. Take care.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.
Ooh, do we have a question?
Oh, you have a question? Okay.
Yes, thank you for catching that. I thought the webinar is going to end before I ask my question. Okay, so my question is to you, Adil and Ram, because you both have extensive experience in recruiting. So, for instance, when someone is trying to switch from one industry to another, maybe someone like me who's been in health informatics in e-commerce, but I want to start to hop into the fintech or banking space. How do I tune my resume to kind of stand out within a pool of candidates who've been in this industry for a while, and where industries have a bias towards people who have experience in that industry?
It's an excellent question, Edwin. So let me perhaps, I'm going to give you two pieces of advice, right? One is transferable skills, right? So you want to make sure that in your CV, obviously you've already got a technical background. You want to highlight the technical skills that are there. And I'm going to give you something practical to be able to have a look at on that side. I myself found, for example, I have a LinkedIn profile, and if you go into the LinkedIn Premium, which you can free trial, it shows you which words actually are most associated with your profile. And I was surprised because the words weren't coming, the words that or the experiences or the key skills that were coming through didn't match with what I had, and some of the ones that they said I didn't have, I did have. So I had to play around with my profile until it said that. And a lot of the stuff that, for example, we post on LinkedIn, similar algorithms are used by the banks to screen their candidates. So here's something that you could practically do, right? Make sure that those skills and experiences are coming through in your CV. And as I said, you can use LinkedIn to do that. The second thing that I would say is it goes back to what I said. Research the industry, and in your particular case, generally I'm not an advocate of a cover letter, right? But for someone like you in that case, it would make sense to write a cover letter so that you can then demonstrate that that you're keen, one, to switch industries, but also that you've taken the time to understand that move and what you can offer.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adil. We have one more person who's Josephine wants to ask a question. We'll have this as the last question because I know you've got another call that you need to get into. Josephine, you had a question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I heard something about please can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes, we
can.
can.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay, so I heard something about asking for feedback when you are on the interview. So how do we go about that? Should we wait until the meeting is done or the interview is done, then you raise up your hand or you seek permission to say, I don't know if I'm going to get this job or not, but I want to know if I've done well, if there's anything I can. Is that how we are supposed to go about it, please?
Excellent question, Josephine. In terms of feedback for an interview, obviously never on the never during the interview, right? Because, for example, if you are there with a panel or one or two individuals, it might take some time for that individual to digest and reflect, right? So I would complete the interview, say thank you, and for their time, and then go off. What I would say is related to what you're saying. Uh, to send a follow-up email the next day, right? To the the thanking the individual for taking that time to interview and spend their time with you. Be surprised how powerful that is for the manager, because the next day they will typically be thinking about who to hire. A thank you shows a lot about how thoughtful your personality is, but also will make you fresh in their mind again. And then, if you are unsuccessful in getting the job, or you have not heard, in a week's time, I would then send a follow-up email and say, I understand I've not been successful. Would you be willing to take some time to provide a feedback? And what I would say is, if you perhaps said something to someone like to say, if you could give me one or two bullet points that I could use to strengthen or improve myself, you're probably more likely to get a response. Because very often people will just say, can you give me feedback? Folks are busy; they won't take time out to write long paragraphs. But if you say, could you give me, if you could take your time out to write me two bullet points that I could focus on, folks will respond.
And absolutely, and yet no, I agree with Adil. And I mean, asking for a feedback right after the interview shows your lack of confidence therein. So, but wait till you know the next stage, which basically is the thumb rule. Follow up email, wait for a week or two, and then send an email asking them to provide some feedback, but be very specific on the number of bullet points that you want, which is exactly what Adil want. One of the other things that I would also say is if you've actually gone through a recruitment agent or a third party provider, I would actually go back to them also and keep them in good humor because they would probably get to hear more than what you would get as feedback from the company. So they might be able to offer a bit more insight into what that specific job or that company or that manager was looking for, which you had, but it could have been better. That's what it is. Hopefully that answers your question, Josephine. And that brings us neatly to the end of the
Thank
session.
you
We've
very
just Thank you. Thank you. Hope you guys found the session useful. And Adil, thanks once again for
Thank
your
you,
time
everyone.
and sharing for your knowledge. Speak soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.